And welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Allison, Washington State Historical Society. We are recording this and I'll share that recording to the YouTube channel, which is really just kind of limited to heritage outreach content. We had a lot of interest in this session and lots of folks who had conflicts. And so they were hoping that we'd record that for them, which we most certainly will do. Before we go any further, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that the Washington State Historical Society is located on the traditional lands of the Puyallup people who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. We pay respect to their elders past and present. And I also want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands where you all are joining us from today. Before we get started, I just want to mention one program three programs really coming up. You'll all be getting an email from me in the next day or two about this. I've already posted it on the Facebook group. But starting April 6th, we have a 3-session series called Recruiting and Engaging Museum Volunteers. It's going to be April 6th, 20th, and then May 4th. So there's 3 sessions. It's free. It's open to any heritage orgs in Washington. We are limiting capacity for this one. So we're limiting it to 20 organizations, and we're asking that 2 people from each organization attend. It's kind of confusing. Hopefully that makes sense. So we want to make sure that you can kind of process all of this information in dialogue with a colleague, a fellow volunteer. So because it's a little bit of a different logistical setup, if you're interested in that, just email me. It's going to be first come, first served. We'll fill, anyone in the first 20 organizations that sign up will be good to go. It's going to be led by the authors of this book, Recruiting and Managing Volunteers in Museums, Christy Van Hoven and Lonnie Wellman. One of the benefits of our new Zoom world is they can just call in from Toronto and upstate New York, where they both live. And so there's more information on the Facebook group, again, an email in the next day or two that will break down specifically the topics for each of those sessions, everything from, just growing your volunteer program, recruiting new volunteers, setting up engaging opportunities for e-volunteers, volunteers that are just kind of digitally engaged. So it should be a really, really great series of sessions. So that's the next thing coming up for us, and I wanted to make sure to let you all know about that. Otherwise, we can move on with our exciting topic today. It's very exciting and very necessary. Maybe not as sexy as some of the other things that we've talked about, but I think we all can recognize that finding the funds to support our organizations is vitally important. In some cases, a matter of life and death. So I'm so happy to have John Shaw here today from the Westport South Beach Historical Society and Stephanie Lyle from the Harbor History Museum, both of whom have a lot of experience getting funds and negotiating and interacting with our local LTAC lodging tax advisory committees. So they'll have some tips and suggestions. We're not a huge group today, so I know that some of you have your own experiences with LTAC money, with lodging tax money, so feel free to either, well, first of all, please introduce yourself in the chat. I forgot to say that. I keep forgetting that. I feel like we're so deep into this, my shtick is a little rusty, but definitely share ideas and thoughts and questions freely in that chat, and if it feels comfortable, I even invite you to unmute and ask questions, which we normally don't do, but again, we're a smaller group. So with all of that said, I'm going to toss it over to John first and let him take it away.
Okay, I'll unmute. Okay, this first time I've done this with this kind of group. Normally I'm in some different settings, but I've gotten pretty used to Zooming. I think this is all about money, and I'll just be blunt about that. I fell in from a business background in my retirement to picking up the strings at an aged out organization that had a wonderful history. And as I stepped in and started learning museology, I find that museology is great fun, but 75% is about money and empowering everything else to happen, keeping the doors open. So I had not been an expert on LTAC by any means, but early on, I was exposed to it as a possible funding source, so I learned about it. I watched what our city did We're a small town in Westport. And like a lot of cities 6-7 years ago, they really focused on events. And they would look at their budgets and fund events because LTAC is for promoting tourism. And we found that in reading the WAC and what LTAC is supposed to do, museums fit in there very, very well. They're very core to what LTAC does, but it had, in most cases, somebody's not promoting their museum as tourism. I'm a big believer in museums as as economic engines and the importance of tourism. So we started going after our local LTAC, which is easier in a small town. But as a small town, we're a coastal economy that has a large LTAC budget. So Westport's 1,900 people, but we have a pushing $400,000 a year LTAC budget. Aberdeen's $35,000 in the big city in Grays Harbor, and they may only have $60,000 a year because it's related to hotel rooms. I think, are there any people here from King County? Maybe, maybe not. King County has an enormous LTAC budget. In fact, a few years ago, they basically encumbered the LTAC income in a bond program that put, I think it's over $1 billion in play through LTAC. There's about 500 million into homeless, 400 million into arts and humanities, museums and whatnot, and then a breakdown into some other tourism. But it can be really big and it can be really small. So we ended up deciding that we'd take a tack to engage with our city, and we had a good relationship in operating our museum. For those who don't know, our historical society was founded 36 years ago. We had a relationship from the beginning with the city to take on the historic Coast Guard station and turn it into a maritime museum and a community museum. We engaged heavily with the Coast Guard and operated the lighthouse. And then we were able to, in 2004, actually take ownership of the lighthouse and land. So we own the corner land and the lighthouse as a society in Westport there, where you see the lighthouse behind me. So we operate two really busy points of engagement in our town. And it became a pretty, for a salesman, it became a pretty easy story to sell. So we went to the city council. Little things that I would recommend that people do is, if you're in a town or a county where you have LTAC, it's engagement. Get to know the LTAC committee, get to know all your city council people, or get to know your county commissioners, the people that are going to ultimately decide. Make sure they see you, make sure you document what you do. And so it becomes a really easy story after a while, but it took a couple years of selling. We really had to continue to sell. There was a lot of resistance. Museums, oh guys, you guys always want money. Well, but we're going to prove to you that we are an important economic engine. And some of that was, I was told, let's talk about details, because some of you guys already know how LTAC works. In a minute, we'll get back to any questions on LTAC. We did some of the simple things, like we really engaged in training volunteers to get our visitors to engage by signing guest logs. We didn't ask for a lot of information and we didn't insist, but we ended up building, and every year we are turning over to the city large bindered books that show that we're signing in 16 to 17,000 people through paid engagement. That's our paid engagement at the museums. And we've become the only tourism enterprise in our area that actually can show or has a way to prove that we have engagement with the public. And so when we go battle for funding, that's a really important thing, because LTAC in a number of ways wants to tie you to showing that you're gonna hear me say this a few times, putting heads in beds. Okay, heads in beds is a core component of most decision process in LTAC, and LTAC committees traditionally look at that. So you want to start accumulating what you do and how you engage. And you know, this is scalable. It works for a bigger operation. It works for smaller. But you want to be able to prove somehow your engagement. Is that making sense to everybody so far? Let's back up. Are there any real core questions about what LTAC is? Is everybody? And I have a bad habit, like everybody, of saying LTAC. LTAC is Lodging Tax Advisory Committee, and it really refers to the committee that then would report recommendations to a city council or a county commission. We're actually talking about lodging tax funds.
Yeah, Mizu has a question there. Do you ask?
Yeah.
Yeah, see it. Do you ask?
We play the game of, we have a nice little book there where we ask people, oh, it's very important that we'd like to know where our guests are from. It helps us. We don't, and if you'd like to give us more information, there, you know, there's a spot, name, location, and then it's phone, email, you know, would you like to be contacted? And we don't share that information. We've actually tried to engage the city with it through our other marketing programs, but it's only of certain value. You know, it's not like we're selling you know, mailing lists to anybody. But we find that good docents or good volunteers who engage without being pushy, you know, I think we get 80% of people to happily write down their name and location. And I like going to city council with these big 3-ring binders and then the spreadsheet of where everybody came from. And we go through and mine it, and we turn in with our individual LTAC requests. They get to that in a minute. We have event requests, we have project requests, and then we have general support requests. So as you can tell, it's about the money. Yeah, zip codes are great. So we'll go through and be able to show that we have so many people from every state. We have people from around the world and countries. Key to looking at this in Washington would be to show that they came from beyond 50 miles. That's kind of a number that you might hear. You know, what did you do to bring people from beyond 50 miles? And so for us, you know, one of our large engagements is basically that wad of people in King County and down in Oregon who come in. Those are our biggest segments, and we do track those by zip codes. Let's see. I'm sorry, I'm reading the chat.
Yeah, it's no problem. And if anybody has any just general questions about how, like, what LTAC is, because we just kind of dove right in, feel free to put them in that chat, and we will definitely answer them.
And there's a very
and I'm going to talk about that too. So
yeah.
Very fair question just jumped in. We are in a, like I said, we are in a more tourist friendly location. So LTAC is a bigger issue for us, and it's got a bigger budget. But LTAC happens in almost every city and county to some extent. And like I said, it's kind of scalable. And whether it's big money or little money, it's money, in my view, that museums deserve, because that's one of the intentions of the rules within the WAC. It specifically supports this kind of activity. Museums anywhere, you know, I'm really preaching to the choir here, you know, are you know, really places where people who visit, whether you're a tourist town or you're not a tourist town, but people still visit you, your museum is generally where you're going to engage with a visitor. You know, that's how they're going to learn about your community. So how do you qualify to be considered? These aren't specifically grants. Let's keep in track. LTAC funds is not general fund of the city. It is a tax that's added on. Grays Harbor happens to be exempt from some of the, you can only get 2%, and then if you ask for more than 2%, it comes out of your sales tax allowance. Grays Harbor was exempted in a grandfathering move and set way back when. And so you will find that you could be somewhere between 2% up to 4+% what your local amount that comes in is. I don't think we ever consider it, or it's termed a grant. It's basically funding that is approved from the city from that special tax fund. So, and you are required to report on it when you turn in for reimbursement when you do events. So a lot of times you guys may be familiar with LTACs are very organized towards event. You go in and you say, we're going to host XYZ event at the museum, and we want to have a couple $1,000s to add to our marketing base and yada, yada. And then you're going to turn in information about how many people you think you got. For us, and the reason I was talking about the books is we have advocated over about 3 years that we advocated and were granted ongoing overhead support, recognizing our importance as a core component of local tourism. And I think these are buzzwords. I think utilize these even if you're in a littler town. I mean, I'm in a town of 1,900 down there, so it's not like, but we do get we have a lot of tourists. So it's easy for me, but you got to sell it. You got to sell it. You got to get people to be willing to recognize the importance in the community. But this ask fits. It fits really well. I'm looking at, okay, you got the RCW up there. That saves me having to stick it up for anybody that wants to see it, and be familiar with RCW. How many people have museums where they have a relationship with their local government? I mean, it's probably a bunch of, we don't in the museum at the lighthouse, but we do at the museum. That's a really perfect tie-in, to benefit from that. LTAC money can be used to buy museums. LTAC money can be used to support museums. LTAC money can be used to support operations of museums. So if you may be in a town where all they want to do is spend your LTAC money on hosting the local car show or the chainsaw show. We have a lot of that background in Grays Harbor. You have to go fight for that.
There was a question
Yeah,
about.
I appreciate the question. It kind of helps keep me on track here.
Yeah. And I know Stephanie probably is I'll let her jump in here in a second too. I think there was a question that Eric had a second ago that I'll maybe save for the end because I'd love to hear from both of you just about what your projections are or how you're imagining LTAC will be impacted by the events of the past year. I know that there's, a lot of concern about that. I also wanted to mention, you mentioned King County, and we've had Nicole Klein join us from the ASUW Shell House up at UW. So am I correct that For Culture really manages all of the LTAC money for museums? Is it possible to apply for additional funding from King County LTAC? Does anybody know outside of For Culture? Do you happen to know, Steph?
Don't.
I think that For Culture is the sort of designated kind of entity.
Yeah, the trick is that every county and city is a little bit different. Yeah. And that's why you got to kind of dig into your own locale. Like, for example, here in Gig Harbor and probably in Westport, there's a city within a county that is collecting its own lodging tax, and therefore it has determined that it has control over that lodging tax. Whereas in the larger Pierce County, it's a little bit different for organizations that are just in the county. So we can address that a little bit more.
And the other little bit of flavoring on this whole thing has been this push to allow, because we live in a world where there's just never enough to go around, but LTAC funds have started to being diverted for homeless issues. And that's happened in King County, and that's happened if you go to MRSC, you'll see how that's now a correct designation that, and which is a little frustrating because, it's already tough to be a museum. I tell our group all the time, we we want to support our museum, our lighthouse, all these wonderful things, but in so many places we're competing against starving cats and underprivileged children and homeless and all the other things in society. And so when we see these funding piles continue to get picked apart politically, we have to fight for it a little bit. You want to save that one about suspended?
Yeah, let's talk about that at the end, because that's sort of, I think,
Yeah,
I'd love to hear from folks across the board, sort of what they're hearing from their local LTAC about.
Well, and somebody mentions, like Harriet says, they don't know how they can do that. And that's a great reaction. And then if you're like me and I'm fairly politically, I don't want to say connected, but I follow and I deal in, as government affairs more than a lot of places. They can pretty much do anything you can imagine when it comes to money. Yeah, go ahead, Harriet.
Well, I sit on our county LTAC board, and we have a conversation coming up on Thursday. But I mean, they're very strict about what we can spend that money on. And I've read the RCW and everything. I just don't see how in the world they're getting away with that.
Well, if you go to MRSC and look at the new updates that came out through, I find I go back and reread this stuff. And over the last 3 years, I've found that the guidance that comes down from MRSC on LTAC, is just an ever-changing landscape. And you might go through there and it'll talk about how counties and locations can earmark funds to the homeless. And of course, the people running your county are going to be really quick to find it, to figure out, oh, there's another place to get some money. Because we have along the coast here, we have the benefit of having fairly substantial LTAC budgets, but there's also a lot of mistakes that get made. Do I have anybody? I don't see the North Beach guys or Ocean Shores, so I can talk bad about them. But Ocean Shores has $1.2 million in LTAC funds a year. And we always think about all the good we can do with that. But the city council put themselves into an arrangement and a construction of a convention center that now takes $1.3 million a year to support and doesn't make any money. And so it's basically been draining the LTAC budget for all the greater good it could do for a number of years. Now, and so that's why I think as groups, myself, I'm very engaged now at the county and at both cities. Because you can kind of see some of these mistakes coming.
Thank you so much, John. I'm going to let you kind of continue to monitor the chat, if you wouldn't mind, as questions come up, and I'm going to turn it over to Steph for a little bit. Did you want to just touch on something?
No.
Okay, you look like you were.
No, let me stop talking for a minute.
Oh yeah, no problem. No, that was great. Thank you so much. And again, as you mentioned, every city and county is so different, and that's part of the challenge of having this conversation. And I'm so appreciative to all of you in the chat for kind of describing what the situation and the landscape looks like where you are. I also partly intended, and I know both you and Steph are gonna do this for us, to get us kind of fired up about this. I think as advocates for our sector, it's useful to get some ammunition. So I'll let Steph get us fired up here.
Okay, well, get ready, everybody. Well, I came on to the Lodging Tax Committee here in Gig Harbor, and Gig Harbor is part of Pierce County, but it collects and manages its own LTAC fund. And when I started here at the Harbor History Museum in 2017, I really didn't have any familiarity with LTAC at all. It was something that we were trying to get someone on our museum staff to be a part of, because we knew that there were resources there that were just not being allocated to the museum or even applied for by our museum. So that took some learning. As I mentioned, as John mentioned, it is an RCW and it's statewide. What I have found is that it varies from place to place. The state law associated with it is very specific, but how it's managed in different places can change quite a bit. So for example, what Pierce County does with their lodging tax funds is different than what Gig Harbor does with their lodging tax funds. And this last year, the staff put forward a a resolution for the city council to approve $125,000 of lodging tax dollars to go specifically towards a nonprofit grant program. Now, I knew by looking at the budget that it was $1 million. I mean, there was like $1 million, and they earn somewhere between $700,000 and $1 million a year just on lodging tax in our local area. But the city has this thing about reserving all this fund. There's this huge pile of reserve funds just in case a rainy day, or there's a flood or something. But basically they want to be able to pay the tourism, half of the tourism department's salaries with that lodging tax money. And so there's actually been huge arguments within our city council about using that reserve money or not using that reserve money. So this is why I would say, if you have an opportunity even to sit in on a lodging tax committee meeting or become part of your lodging tax committee, that would be a great thing. Some of you already are, and those of you that are already on LTAC know that they have to have equitable representation from those that receive the funds and those that collect the funds. When I first started on LTAC, I was like, wait a second, it feels like this is just a marketing budget for the local hotels. And that's me being catty, okay? I love our hotels. Our hoteliers are terrific, and all the people that run vacation homes and stuff are fantastic here. But the reality is that this is not money that is specific to marketing motels and hotels. This is money, if you look at the original RCW that was written, that was intended to fund cultural arts and heritage organizations. And I'm going to attempt to share my screen, and I put together a few little slides that may or may not help us today, but we'll see. So it's kind of quick and dirty lodging tax inside view. And I am pretty candid about this because I'm also very passionate about it. Because as John said, we're museums, we're always looking for money. And it is really tough if you don't have any dedicated funding stream from a municipality to be able to actually keep your museum going. So when there are these kinds of funds that are out there and available, you really want to be able to get in there and apply for them. So I pulled up the RCW that was the original authorization of lodging tax. And there is an intent at the very, very bottom of that page on the web. It actually says that it was intended for locally funded heritage and arts programs that build vital communities and preserve community history and culture. That is a line that I have actually shared with our city administrators who poo-poo me. And I'm like, well, I'm a historian. I always am going to get to the bottom of an idea. So you can't just tell me that this is a tourism promotional fund. That is one of the primary things that it's for, but it's not the only thing that it's for. So, and to that, oh my God, sorry, my phone is ringing. It's all happening at once. I can be not online forever, and the phone never rings. So anyway, so tourism promotion is definitely at the top of the rung, but there's also the acquisition of tourism related facilities, and probably most importantly to all of us, the operation of tourism related facilities. Now, one of the things that came up in our city, I don't know if other folks have encountered this at all, but the rule apparently changed in 2013 that says that you can only apply capital dollars from LTAC to a municipal funded site. So for example, Gig Harbor is well known for buying up historic sites and preserving them, and then having a nonprofit be formed to run them. So in that case, they could use LTAC dollars to build something or do historic preservation work or build bathrooms or something like that, if it's a site that's owned by the city. But if it's like our museum, the Harbor History Museum is independently owned and operated, and we cannot receive capital funds from the LTAC because of that change in the law. We can receive funds for operation, of the museum. And so what I typically do will come up with a project or a program that they can really wrap their heads around. And I will say that we've made some progress in the last couple of years, because we've gone from, literally giving our film festival, which is amazing, like $1,000 to like $20,000. So that is a definite improvement there. So that's where I think it's helpful to get on an advisory committee or even sit in on the advisory committee, because those should be public meetings, and just learn a little bit more about how folks think. So typically advisory committees are made of both collectors and receivers, as I said. And then in some municipalities, they have at-large positions. I noticed that Pierce County has a couple of vacancies. I don't know if any of you are looking for some fun ways to spend your time, but that could be one. The committee has the power to recommend, but the governing body that oversees and approves LTAC ultimately would be like your city or county council. So like in Gig Harbor, our lodging tax committee could recommend that we fund everybody at the full amount, but ultimately the city council can actually make a choice about the ultimate distribution of funds to each of those organizations. Yeah. So the last, serve on the committee if you get a chance. You just learn a lot, and probably too much sometimes. And I get fired up about this stuff because I really do feel like museums deserve to have a significant portion of this money, and a lot of it gets spent. Like in our situation, the city in this year's budget received more than $400,000 of LTAC money, whereas no other organization could apply for anything more than $20,000. So I think there's some work to be done there. The reporting side of it, and I know there was a question about reporting, not only reporting, but the applications themselves ask for really weird, like, how could you even know this, like telepathic kind of information. And, those of you that have filled out these applications before, it's like, well, I don't know how many people came from 50 miles away. Maybe I could guess that with a zip code report, but I don't know if those people stayed overnight, because I'm not going to ask them those personal questions when they come to my desk. That's weird, And so you wind up estimating, or you spend a whole lot of time with people chatting just to try to find out whether they stayed overnight here or not. And it's like, it's just almost impossible to collect some of the information that they want. And I'm not really sure the origin of why people feel that information is so important, but it is what it is. And then in theory, if you're on the committee, you may be able to help define whatever reporting is required in your area. So we shall see. I don't know. Do I have anything else? Nope, I don't. So maybe that helps answer the questions a little bit. And I'm happy to, throw out some more info too.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Yeah, and there's definitely been some great kind of information in the chat just from folks. I don't know if anybody else who's on the call wants to kind of share a little bit about how it works in your county, and anything that you found particularly useful in the application process, or anything that sort of surprised you that you maybe want to give people a heads up about. I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but So Joe, you were saying that you apply for both city and county LTAC money, and I suppose that's probably true for quite a few municipalities that are sort of big enough. Yeah, Harriet as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I know in our area too, there's like the local LTAC, but then there's also a bigger one more for like big festivals and events and stuff. And there's a lot of information that you have to include in that application. My friend that was executive director of the film festival was applying for that. And it's a fair amount of money, but it's also a really complicated application. And I sometimes look at these things and wonder, like, who invented this? Clearly, these people are not the people who are actually trying to support their organizations with grant applications, because otherwise they would make it a lot simpler and it's more straightforward.
The the information that you give back on those classic reports, like how many people came, they go to, have you ever seen the JLARC reporting that goes to the legislature? That's where that goes. And so it aggregates all of those silly questions in that fixed form. And it doesn't make any sense to the legislators either. Nobody looks at it. It's just an accumulation of paperwork, which the state likes. But that's where that all goes. And nobody's really gotten to where they push on, reforming how that's reported and what they're really doing with it. You mentioned that your local LTAC is banking money, and that's been a topic that's coming up that I think is coming back to a head. It used to be that you have to spend all your LTAC money. If you had a carryover because you took the second collection, it needed to be a stadium tax or an earmarked. And in the last couple of years, because there's been so much of a rub about that, that's kind of disappeared as a rule. Formerly, it was if you were collecting and saving you couldn't have a rainy day fund out of LTAC funds. It's the nature of that tax money. It must be spent each year fully. That's why LTACs generally are not, I think, still in the WAC, are not allowed to fund certain things multiple year, because there isn't a tax base for it. You have to see what they get. And that's going to, I think, become another topic coming up, that if the cities want to earmark or hold on to, or, not spend those funds directly, it has to be for a declared purpose. And that declared purpose has to fit. Anyway, sidebar. So
yeah. That is very true. There's a question that just came up, the whole heads and beds thing. I have to believe, and this is just my humble opinion and observation, that this is something that is very much driven by the hoteliers.
Sure.
And that they're like, well, you got to tell me what program you're going to have that's going to bring me people in February when my visitation is lowest. I'm like, that's not my job. That's not the purpose of this fund. So
that's what we hear. The other things you're going to hear is shoulder season. Using LTAC to drive shoulder season is a big thing nowadays. There's a lot of things, and you kind of wonder as you dig in where this stuff comes from.
Yeah.
And the other side is like, well, we follow the rules, I think, pretty diligently. If you're a city or an organization or a municipality under 5,000, you're not auditable.
Right.
If you're above, you're only required to have an LTAC committee if you're above 5,000, and only then are you auditable. And if you are below 5,000 in your population, you can pretty much do whatever you want. And that's where it gets it can get a little sketchy. But Grays Harbor, understand, because we've had over the years, what had happened is Grays Harbor had a single LTAC. And then because each beach became such a vibrant component over time, it was argued and prevailed that each of the beaches become their own LTAC. So we get the money that comes from our location, Ocean Shores, and then the county gets the rest. And just because you're going to probably see it in the news someday, everybody know what Seabrook is? Okay, Seabrook basically is this enormous engine of tourism. And so Grays Harbor County, as a county, has had a very successful run of tourism, yet 85% of that fund comes from the Little, Butt, and the Seabrook, because they are, they pay into the county, and they will probably in the near future be going to control their own LTAC funding. So, it's fascinating politics. So.
Yeah. Well, and whenever there's money on the table, there's always something, where some people will want to spend it one way and others not. So I think it's important too, like John was mentioning the MRSC, and it's got an updated version of the use of revenues, and I'm just looking at it right here, but basically it's tourism marketing and operations for special events and festivals designed to attract tourists, operations and capital expenditures of tourism related facilities owned or operated by a municipality. And those are the ones that can get capital money. And then operations of tourism related facilities owned or operated by nonprofit organizations. I think it is important too for museums to remind our decision makers that museums are economic engines. I know that Inspire Washington uses the figure $32 per visitor as an average economic benefit to the areas around the museums. So never miss a minute to remind people that museums are not just sitting here waiting for people to show up, that we actually are doing other things, and that when people do show up, they not only come to a museum, but they go other places too. So it, could be out to lunch, it could be staying overnight, it doesn't really matter. And the truth is, cities get money both from LTAC and from the sales tax. So anything that we can do to remind people that we are doing a lot for the community is really important.
Yeah, take your annual visitation, multiply it times 32, and that's the claim that you can make to your economic impact in the community for sure. Hey, Steph, will you drop that link to the MRSC in the chat? Can you do that?
Yeah, kind of.
Oh, sorry. I was trying to find it and I wasn't sure I was.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, it's just mrsc.org, but I'm on 2 different computers, so.
Oh, sure. Well, that's
but I'll see if I can find it and put it in there. So.
Yeah, no worries. I'm curious, how many of your organizations get some of your annual operating budget from LTAC? Like your operating expenses, yeah.
Well, no, I don't get operating. I get like special project stuff.
Yeah, sort of.
Yeah. But I mean, I roll that into my marketing budget. I basically okay, I'll just put that as LTAC because we don't really have a marketing budget unless we get it for special funding.
Yeah, cool. Well, to get back to Eric's question from earlier, I know like making predictions is a dangerous thing to do these days. And of course it's going to vary wildly, but I'm just curious what you're anticipating for the next year or two, as far as, funds and these LTAC funds having been impacted by COVID. What do you think?
Go ahead, John.
Well, I kind of embarrassed to say, but during COVID, our LTAC income has increased dramatically. People have wanted to go to the beach. And so while some restaurants and certain things like us, we're down in admissions because operating during, basically closures and then operating under guidance and restrictions means we've seriously reduced the amount of people. You can't get a room, a tent, a camp spot on the coast to save your soul. So that's a fortunate thing here. So our LTAC revenues are up, but there's so many other issues, that come with COVID for the museums.
Yeah.
I'm sure that's not the case everywhere.
I think that we've been hearing a lot that there would be a hold on LTAC funds, that, visitations were down and this stuff. And, in theory, that's one of the city's claims for having a reserve. I don't necessarily know that that's really necessary, but it's always interesting to sort of see different people's perspectives on it. Well, I'll back up a second. One of the things that happened with us was that we had this allocation of $125,000 available for nonprofit grants. And it was so poorly advertised that I was on the committee and I didn't even know when the deadline was. And so unless you had talked to the mayor, you talked to someone on staff, or you heard it through the grapevine, you didn't even hear about the deadline. And so they didn't even get enough applications to distribute all of the funds. So they're doing a second round this spring that has been very well advertised because, few people have made some suggestions about how to get the word out a little bit better. And so I think that we'll have quite a few applications, and there's $50,000 left. But my point was, what we want to do is really have a fund that is based on percentages. So if there's a certain percentage that goes to the city and a certain percentage that goes to grant funds, and there's a certain percentage that could be held in reserve or used for whatever other purpose, but it's a percentage, so that when the fund goes up, the percentage is higher, and when the fund goes down, it's lower, so that people can really get a sense of how best to use these funds. Because I just really, really believe that at the heart of all of this, as I said in the first slide, was that, you know, there is an intention to recognize that cultural and heritage organizations really make a huge difference for communities and for the promotion of tourism, that they really need to acknowledge that and support that. And this is one way to do it. I like the comment about polling the hotels, and I had actually made a recommendation that we do a survey of the people that are staying in hotels, and if they were going to decide how they wanted their tax dollars spent, what would that look like? Boy, that got shot down. But I actually think that would be a really interesting exercise.
Yeah.
And we know that when we ask people how they feel about museums, they care deeply about them. So we can imagine what the result would be.
Yeah, I mean,
From a tourism standpoint, we're going through a cycle in our county about you know, the importance of events. Classically down here, you know, it's been events sucking up a tremendous amount. But there's some people like Roger Brooks, who's one of the gurus of tourism, you know, who's done Ocean Shores, Leavenworth, Winslow, Arizona. We hired him last year, and he basically said, get ahead of the curve, forget about events. Events are not the future. You want to be about activities and things that people can do in your community. And that was really not taken well by a lot of people in our community who see the season as pirate days, crab races, seafood festival. But this past year, where we're unable to have any of those, and at the same time saw this dramatic increase in heads in beds because people just wanted to come, and we had people wanting to see the lighthouse, the museum, the beach. You know, it was a really good turning the ship towards an understanding there. And so that's probably going to happen, I think, in more areas. Tourism, the guys at the upper end of tourism are starting to basically get off the event bandwagon. And that's going to be a little bit of a rocky road, I'm sure, but it leans well for us because what they do is they point to the importance of us as activities in the local community. We classically have had this one angle where, you know, sport fishing, we're the salmon capital of the world in Westport. And you know what? Every guy who goes out and salmon fishes, this is a bit sexist and probably politically incorrect. The story has always been that dad went out and salmon fished and mom and the kids went to the museum and lighthouse. So.
Well, and I have to say that shift away from events sure seems prescient now. I mean, I can't imagine feeling comfortable anytime soon being in a large crowd, even if it is outside.
Yeah.
Well, that's it. All of our events
for a different kind of engagement is really smart.
Yeah, our events all involve public food and people all close together, and nobody wants to do that. And it may be a while before people get comfortable.
Yeah.
We have just a few more minutes. I wanted to, not to put you on the spot, Joe, but have you been hearing in Skagit County what they're kind of anticipating as far as funding for the coming year and what kind of impact COVID's had?
Well, for this year, for 2021, I got all that I asked for. I got the full amount, and that's very rare because normally I ask for the moon and I get, you know, a few stars. But this year I got the full amount. And the reason being, so many of the big events that normally would take didn't even apply because they knew it wasn't going to happen this year. And so we got our full distribution. We're seeing, you know, even in LaConner, we're seeing the hotels that are open fully and have been for some time. They are sold out every weekend. There are people from, and if you're familiar with Skagit geography, Mount Vernon is about 20 minutes from LaConner. There's people from Mount Vernon who are coming to LaConner to stay in a hotel just to get away. So, you know, there's a lot of that. But the big, you know, revenue things that normally put the heads in beds, soccer tournaments, softball tournaments, those sorts of events that come to the county and fill all the hotels in Burlington aren't happening. So we'll see.
Mhm.
They've said we'll get what we can, and the county's very supportive of us as a museum. So we'll see. All 100% of what we get from LTAC, from both the city and the county, is for advertising. We don't do any, we budget no advertising in our operating budget. It's all LTAC. That's what we've always done. So.
Yeah, interesting. What about Michael and Mizu? Have you guys heard anything about Pierce County and Tacoma? I mean, I don't think that Tacoma hotels have been fully booked during this pandemic the way that some of the kind of less densely populated areas are. I haven't heard sort of what the projections are for funding. Michael, did you have any insight into that? Stepped away.
And he's gone.
Yeah. No, I'd be interested to see, because as you guys have described, it's just.
What was the question?
Oh, it's just about whether you've heard, about projections for LTAC funding for the coming year or two as a result of impacts of COVID in Tacoma and Pierce County.
I have not heard anything on that.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see how the more kind of urban places kind of bounce back and have fared. Yeah. Oh, Mizu says 5 hotels are not filled. we got the news for other reasons. Yeah. It's just, it makes so sense now that I hear you all say it, that people have been seeking out places that they feel safe going, and that's been a real boom for some areas of the state and not for others. Yeah. Well, are there any other questions for Stephanie and John, or any other things that you two would like to kind of share? And I also just want to let you know that as is often the case, these conversations kind of continue after the programs are over. So, even if sometime next year you're working on an LTAP application and you have a question like, this question seems funny, what are they actually looking for here, or anything like that, I hope that you will always feel comfortable reaching out to me, and then I'll just find one of these other smart people and ask them. But yeah, any other questions for these folks before we sign off?
Just one thing I would add is that, it is clear in the RCW that LTAC funds can be used for general operations. And if you need general operations, you have the right to go to your city council and ask for that help. Anybody that is a community member in an organization that is within a community that's not getting already direct line municipal funds, you do have the right to be able to do that. And I think we don't do that quite enough. So I know that some counties and some cities around the state do use the LTAC money for museum operations. I think this year, maybe more than any other time, operating money is really, really critical. I mean, if we didn't get about $60,000 of PPP money last year, we would have really been in dire straits. So getting LTAC dollars or even just, asking that, that was something that I advocated for very much last year, when even though organizations that were trying to do events or had applied for program dollars that were going to be, not going to be held, they still had to stay in operations. So those of us that were receivers advocated very hard to make sure that the people that were approved for funding still got their funding, whether they could use it for their programs or not, because otherwise our town would be all the worse for not having those organizations funded. So I think that's really important to remember with this particular pot of money.
Yeah, well, I hope that everybody's feeling kind of empowered, at least. John dropped that MRSC information in the chat too, so that might be a good link. And I'll share that in a follow-up email to everybody as well. But it does kind of feel like thank you, Mizu, for your comment of kind of taking this topic out of the shadows. And it's something that I'm trying to educate myself about. And so I'm happy to kind of learn with you and from you all, and share resources as I come across them as well. But thank you so much to John and Stephanie. I'm so grateful for your generosity and sharing your expertise, and to so many folks on the line who also have some experience with this and were willing to share that with us. I'll post the video probably tomorrow to the YouTube channel, and I'll share that link out. And also keep an eye out for that information about the volunteer management workshops coming up. And otherwise, I'll just wish you all a great afternoon, and thank you so much for spending a little time with us. I always love seeing y'all.
Thanks, everybody. It was great to be
Bye.
here. Thanks, Allison. Thanks,
Yeah,
John.
thanks, John.
Bye-bye.